Welcome to the Keep Yours podcast, where we'll help you decode the complex financial system so you can better understand how to thrive within it. This is where you'll learn strategies and life hacks to stay out of debt, claim your financial power, and keep what's yours. Here's your host, David Bradshaw.
Citizens of the world, welcome back to another podcast to Keep Yours, a survival guide to capitalism. Today, we continue our topic of money. In the last episode, we talked about literally what money is, how it became a construct in our lives, because it hasn't been in most of human humanity. And we talked about why it's needed in commerce, because not having currency would make the bartering system absolutely crazy in today's world. How much of what you do would be required to buy a car at this point or buy a house? So money gives us all a way to conduct commerce in the simple context of that it allows us to determine value of millions of different types of items pretty much instantaneously, simply based off of simple supply-demand economics and what the value of currency is today. So now we're going to go a little further into money and really into how money is used and how that affects you. So most of finance is just taught off of terms and math. I want to bring finance to you in story and history. So we talked about the history of money and how it began. It really came from the Roman Empire was the first place to really have a big amount of centralized money where the world viewed that as a reliable currency that you could trust that the Roman government put an ounce of gold into what was stamped an ounce of gold. And that system is basically perpetuated to today, where whether it's a German British pound or a euro or a US dollar or an Australian dollar or a Canadian dollar or a peso, where they all have basically a known value. And that value can change based off of who's controlling that currency. So in the US, the Federal Reserve controls the currency. Well, if the Federal Reserve decides it's going to print more money, then the value of each dollar is reduced because there are more dollars in circulation. So this is a first piece that you learn about money is when they make more of it, and especially when it's in paper currency or it's not backed by something physical like gold, even though, again, gold doesn't have any intrinsic value. We've just decided that it does. But when there's more money out there, then the value has been diluted. This dilution of value of each dollar is inflation. That's what inflation means. Inflation means there's more dollars in the world than there were yesterday, and therefore the price of things is rising. Now, that doesn't actually have to happen exactly that way. The other thing that can happen is that the demand globally for dollars changes. And we'll get into why that is and factors that do that when we get into some of the more advanced financial concepts. But for today, the other way we want to talk about inflation happening is just that nobody wants to have dollars. So let's just say all of a sudden everyone decided they didn't believe in the full faith of the U.S. government. And they said, I don't think that that's very safe investment in terms of a currency. The government doesn't get along very well. They're probably not going to have very good laws for a while, or taxes are going to rise, or many other things that they may decide the U.S. is not the place that I want to invest, and therefore I don't need dollars. Maybe I want to go invest in Europe. Maybe my opportunities are no longer in the U.S., they're now in the European Union, so I want to transfer my dollars into euros. And if everyone wants to transfer their dollars into euros, then there's an abundance of dollars available and a shortage of euros, which means that the euro would rise in value and the dollar would reduce in value. That's another way you can get to the same thing. Now your dollar is going to be worth less money than it was before. So this is inflation. This is a concept that we hear talked about a lot, but what does that actually mean? You know that when you go to the store and there's inflation, what used to be $1 for a carton of eggs is now $1.10. And that's 10% inflation. Now, it's also possible, it happens rarely, but it's happened a few times in history, and it's happening in one place specifically right now, where the government prints so much currency that you have such high inflation that literally the money becomes worth less. So that happened in Germany. After World War I, between World War I and World War II in Germany, the Allies who defeated the Germans in World War I decided that the Germans should pay for that war. And in doing so, put a huge burden on Germany, such that the only way the Germans could pay the amounts due was to literally print money. Well, that caused what's called hyperinflation. And it became so bad that it was literally more valuable to take your Deutschmarks and burn the paper as fuel for heat than the actual amount that the paper was worth. And it is crazy. But last year, they estimated that Venezuela had 1,000,000% inflation. That means that if you had $1 million at the beginning of 2018 in Venezuela, in Venezuelan currency, I believe it's the bolivar, at the end of the year, that's worth one, because they printed so many. And that's a crazy system to work in. And obviously, if currency goes that far, then it's lost all of its value, which is pretty much what's happened there. And it's a shame. And it's definitely the fault of the government there, without a doubt, 100% to blame. But it is a situation that unfortunately a lot of people have to live with. And it's very sad in my mind. But that's what the word inflation means. And for inflation means that your money is not worth as much as it used to be. And we know that inflation is going to happen as long as population increases, because as population increases, we need more money. We need more money in the system, because if there's not more money in the system, then there's not enough for us all to conduct our own transactions. So we can't grow new businesses and create new wealth if we have the same amount of dollars all the time. We'd all just be chasing those same few dollars. So as the economy grows, the job of the Federal Reserve is to print some more money as needed based off of real growth. And that's not always done correctly, but that's the idea. So the idea that costs will rise, i.e. that inflation will happen, exists because we need more money to conduct more transactions. There's more of us alive. That means there's more transactions happening. So we need more currency. As we print more currency, the value of each dollar gets slightly reduced. If they print too much currency, it could get significantly reduced. Or if there's some reason that people don't want dollars anymore. So inflation basically means that in the future, the money you have today will be worth less than the value that you can get for it today. And understanding inflation is an important concept as we get into other concepts here, because if you understand inflation, which means that my money, my $100 today, in a year from now, will buy the same amount of services as $98, that means that I'm losing 2% of my value. So where this becomes important is if you want to borrow my $100. So if I know that inflation is likely, because it's pretty standard, then if you want to borrow $100 from me, and in a year from now, you want to pay it back. Well, I don't need $100. I need more than that because I want the buying power of my $100 today. So let's say $100 today buys me a week of groceries. But in a year from now, all of a sudden, I have to take an apple out of that cart or 2 apples out of my cart because now it only buys me the equivalent of what $98 today is. And now you want to borrow that $100 and pay me back in a year. Well, I'm going to want my 2 apples back. Why should I get 2 apples less in a year from now for what I'm giving you today? And in fact, not only that, but I want more than that because otherwise I'll just take what I can get today. Why would I give you my money and let you have it for a year? So that concept makes a lot more sense when contexted with inflation. And what I've just described to you is interest. So interest is going to be charged because the money today is going to be worth less in the future. So I need to make sure as the guy loaning the money that I get back an equal value of what I'm giving you today. But then there's a second piece that attaches to that, and that's called risk. And that's the risk that if I give you my $100, I'm not guaranteed that you're going to give me back my, let's just say it's $105 in a year. How do I know I'm going to get my $5 back? How do I know I'm going to get $100 back? I don't. And so depending on who you are, and depending on the relationship I have with you, and depending on your history with borrowing and repaying money, the rate at which I'm going to charge you to allow you to borrow money from me will vary. So this is the concept of interest. So interest is the amount of money that I require back from you to account for first, inflation, and second, risk. So if you're the government right now and you want to borrow money, the government sells 10-year bonds that pay, we'll roughly just call it 2% interest. So that means every year, if I give the government my $100, each year they're going to give me $2 back in interest payments. And then at the end of 10 years, they're also going to give me back my $100. That's considered the safest person to lend your money to. According to Wall Street, according to basically the world economy, because we were basically all agreeing to this, is that governments are pretty much the safest people to lend our money to. And the reason that's considered that way is because governments have the ability to tax their citizens. So assuming the government can't afford to pay it back, well, you say, well, you have to pay me back. You're contractually obligated. The government has 2 options at that point. It can either A, print money. But if they keep printing money, that'll be higher inflation for everybody, which means that everyone will want a higher interest rate. So printing money to get your way out of debt isn't necessarily a good idea because people are going to require a higher premium for that inflation. But the other way they can do it is raise taxes. So if they just raise taxes on everybody, they can collect the money they need to pay back me and the other people that they borrowed money from. That's a pretty easy concept to get. So interest, if we're going to define it, is the cost of money. Now, how that rate is set depends on who you talk to and depends on what you're talking about and depends on the probability of them getting it back from you. So that's going to depend on the way that probability is determined right now in the current world is your credit score. And we'll go into that in future podcasts when we get into the details But for now, we're just trying to discuss the concepts of money and how it works. So right now, we know that we have money. Okay, we know that if and when the government prints more money so that the economy can grow, there will be inflation. And or if people decide that the value of your currency is worth less than other currencies, you could also have inflation for those goods. So for example, if you live in Brazil and you want to buy a car from Germany, you have an exchange rate from the Brazilian currency of the reais to the euro. Well, depending on how much money Brazilian's government has printed and how much growth they have in their economy and how many people want to have Brazilian reals, but real is pronounced reais, I believe. Depending on what that exchange rate is, and that exchange rate fluctuates. So if I buy a Mercedes this year, that the Mercedes-Benz wants, let's just say, 50,000 euros for this car. Well, if my exchange rate's 2-to-1, it costs me 100,000 locally. But what happens if the value of my currency devalues? Well, for everything I buy in my country, it doesn't matter quite as much. But now if it's 4 to 1 euro, then I want to buy that same car. Instead of it costing me 100,000, now it costs 200,000. So this is a way in which you get inflation specifically because of currency fluctuations. So as the dollar gets stronger from the US, it's more expensive for people in other countries to buy our goods because the exchange rate for them is not in their favor, and vice versa. So if the value of Chinese currency compared to the dollar continues to go down, so currently $1 gets you 6.5. But if that goes to 7.5, well, now I can buy that percentage more in goods or get more for the same dollar based on how strong the currency is. So inflation can happen in different ways, or it can be deflation. It can actually get less expensive. So let's go back to the Brazilian wants to buy a car, wants to buy that Mercedes. And I talked to some expats when I was down there. When I was down there, it was trading at about 2.5 to the dollar. Now it's, I believe, 4 to the dollar. They said when they had moved there, it was 8 to the dollar. So when they exchanged $1,000 of US, they got 8,000 Brazilian reals. And those 8,000 reals bought a lot more than that $1,000 would in the US because that currency, the US dollar, was more valued and or the Brazilian currency was less valued. But it can also go the other way. Because if when they moved there, it was at 8 and now it's at 2, well, to me as the tourist coming in, it's much more expensive. But to the Brazilian citizen who wants to buy the Mercedes, and it used to be 8 to 1, that Mercedes used to cost 400,000 of their local currency. And now their dollar gets stronger because their economy is good and growing and people want to invest and therefore want to buy their currency. Well, now all of a sudden it's 2 to 1. Now that $400,000 car just became a $100,000 car. Much better deal. So it can work either way, for you or against you, depending on timing. And I didn't really learn about currency and exchange until I was in foreign countries and actually had to exchange money and had to understand or question, more to the point. Not really understand, I question, why is it that in one country, my dollar, you go to Britain, and the British pound is losing its steam because of Brexit. Certainly not worth what it was. But when I was in Britain, it took $1.5 to get 1 British pound. So that means when I went to the pub and ordered a pint, and it was £4, it was really $6. Then I went to visit my friend in Croatia, And when I was in Croatia, I was getting eight kunas to the dollar. And I could buy a beer in a pub for 7 kunas. So less than $1 got me a beer in a pub in Croatia versus it cost me $6 to get a beer in a pub in England, specifically in London. So it took me a long time to conceptualize and figure out why this is. And no one's going to know exactly why currencies are worth different values all of the time. There's too many things going on. But at the end of the day, in a free market society, it's simply supply and demand. How many dollars are demanded? How many dollars are available? If more dollars are demanded, which typically has to do with investment in the country. So if people want to buy U.S. company stocks, they need to buy those in dollars. And the dividends from those companies are paid in dollars. So you'll often see big companies and they will say, here's what our income or loss is on currency fluctuations. And a lot of times what that means is that the local currency has either increased or decreased in value relative to the dollar. Because if they're a U.S. company, then they're going to report in U.S. dollars. If they're a British company, they're going to report in British pounds. So we're getting into, this is getting a little more complicated than I intended here, but I want to make the case so that you understand what inflation is and why inflation in part drives interest rates. So interest is the price of time on money. And the reason it has to exist, because it doesn't exist in itself for credit. So let's talk about what credit is. So credit is somebody allowing you to pay later for something today. So if you go to the grocery store and you want to buy a week's worth of groceries for yourself, and that's going to cost you $100, but you don't have $100 today because you don't get paid until tomorrow, but the grocery store still wants to sell you groceries, they may tell you, oh, well, you have to come back tomorrow. But if it's a local owned grocer and he knows you because you're his neighbor, he may say, I'll give you credit till tomorrow. And credit's extended all the time. Business to business, credit is extended every day. Mostly on terms. I'll buy this from you and I'll pay you in 30 days. Those are credit terms. I agree to pay you in 30 days. You agree to give me those goods now. And in business, there's often a delay because I need to buy it from you. I need to do what I'm going to do to it. If I'm going to manipulate, if it's raw materials or even if I'm just going to sell it, I need time to sell it. And then when I sell it, I can afford to pay you. And then I have my profit from selling it. So credit is basically saying, it's someone saying, I will defer my receipt and give it to you today. Now, when that usually, and if you have a credit card, that's specifically what it's saying. You're going to the grocery store with your credit card. So instead of the grocery store giving you credit, the credit card company is giving you credit, saying, give them this card, we will pay them today, and you can pay us in 30 days. And then you say, well, why would a credit card company want to do that? Well, there's two reasons. And this is the way, two ways that banks make money with credit cards. The first is they're going to charge that company a transaction fee. So if you go to Kroger today and you buy $100 worth of groceries and you give them your Visa card that is a credit card, then Visa is going to not give Kroger $100. They're going to give them more like $98. So by extending you that credit, Visa got a transaction fee, and the grocery store is willing to accept that transaction fee for ease of commerce, for the ability to not have to wait until you have cash. Because if you only sell to cash-bearing customers, you're going to have a lot fewer customers. And especially now that credit's become pretty much available everywhere. In fact, now there's stores and restaurants that don't even accept cash. Southwest Airlines will not accept cash to purchase anything on an aircraft. You have to have a credit card. So it's become just accepted that, hey, I will pay that fee so that, I don't have to extend them credit. So that's a process that I no longer have to deal with. I don't have to deal with every customer asking me for credit. And I don't have to have an administrator sitting there analyzing whether or not we should give them credit, then calculating what they owe, then trying to go collect it from them later when they don't pay. So all of that part gets outsourced and they don't have to deal with it. And it eases commerce and allows people to buy their goods right there on the spot. So they say, okay, we'll pay the 2% fee. So the person issuing you credit already got 2%. Now, maybe you've got a benefits program attached to that card and you're going to get 1% back. So they're going to give 1% to you, keep 1%, and you pay the bill and that's it. Or you decide, I'm going to need a little bit longer to repay that because it turns out I just spent money I don't really have yet. And it's not within a month of the one billing cycle. It's, I bought a TV on my credit card that cost $1,000. I only have $200 today, and I'm only generating extra cash flow every month of $200. So it's going to take me 4 or 5 months to repay this. Well, then all of a sudden, your credit just turned into a debt. Now it's something that you owe. It's an amount that you owe on your credit card. So credit is the extension of the time to pay. But once you go beyond that time to pay, now you've changed it into a debt. Now it's something that you owe. And that's what a debt is. A debt is an amount that you owe to somebody else. So we've discussed what credit is, what debt is, what interest is, the price of that time that you want on money. And we know what inflation is, which is the other reason that we have to charge for our money because it will be worth less than it is today in the future. So now let's discuss the way that interest works. So first we got to go to what is the rate of interest. And again, we already discussed that the rate of interest for you is going to be based off of many factors. So the culmination of those factors is often what's called your credit score. But essentially, what it's going to boil down to is this. What is the likelihood you're going to repay everything that you owe? And as that likelihood goes up, then your interest rate usually comes down. And if you're really good at repaying your loans, you usually have lower rates. Now, there's also major exceptions to these rules. For example, when you go buy a house, while that whole piece is true, your rate's going to be based off of your ability to repay over the long term. There's a secondary piece when it comes to the interest rate you get for a house. And that is that effectively the government is guaranteeing that mortgage as long as it's underwritten correctly. And because the government's effectively guaranteeing that, you get a lower rate. You also get an extended term of 30 years. And we'll get into this in greater detail down the road. But interest rates vary based off what you're buying, i.e., is that still an asset? So we haven't discussed what an asset is. So an asset is something that you have of value. So it could be currency. Currency is definitely an asset. Or it could be something that you could sell for currency. So if you're buying something that is an asset, then you're going to likely pay a lower amount of interest on that, because if you decide, or if circumstances work out where you can't repay it, then there is something for the loaner, whoever's extended you that credit, to come and take and sell. So your interest rate on a car is going to be less than your interest rate on groceries. Because if you use a credit card to buy your groceries, then you've eaten the groceries, what is there left for me to sell if I'm the one that you owe? There's nothing left for me to sell. All I can do is ask you to repay me. If you say no, I can sue you to repay me, but then maybe you declare bankruptcy and I end up with nothing. So I have a higher risk that that's not going to be repaid, and I don't have an asset attached to that. And these concepts will be more important later, and you'll understand how the financial system works better if you understand these basic concepts. So the interest rate I'm going to charge you has in large part to do with what you're using it to buy. And you may say, well, what if I buy a TV? That's an asset. It is, and so's a car, and potentially also so is a house. But here's the difference. If you buy a house, the likelihood that it's going to be worth a lot less anytime soon is small. The market may fluctuate a little bit, and obviously, since most of us lived through the Great Recession, we have a firmer in the back of our heads that, property values can drop a lot. But let's also be honest and say that's the only time they've dropped that way that fast. And that was a systemic problem throughout the system, and we're not going to get into the details of that today. But on the whole, when you buy a house, the value of that house remains because the dirt hasn't gone anywhere. The cost of building materials to build that house typically rise because of inflation. And the cost of labor to build that house also rises, known as inflation. So the reason that most homes appreciate in value is inflation. And so essentially your house is a store of currency for you, rising every year with inflation. So the risk associated with your house is going to be a lot less. Now, the risk associated with a car, now that's a little bit more, especially if you like to drive a new car. So in the last episode, we talked about what is something worth. And at the end of the day, what is something is worth is what somebody else is willing to pay you for it. So when you go to a car dealership, and let's just say you want to buy a brand new car, and it costs $50,000. Okay, well, look at that brand new car today, and it's $50,000 is the price tag on it. What does one of those cars 2 years old cost? What does one 4 years old cost? What does one 6 years old cost? And what does one 8 years old cost? And the reason this is important is because while you're buying an asset, you're buying an asset that's losing value every year. Because one, you're using it. So a car has, let's just say, 200,000 miles of life. So every mile you drive, you're taking part of that life off of it. And immediately, we all know this, that as soon as you drive a car off of the lot and it's used, it's worth less than the new one. The first 1,000 miles costs a few $1,000s. Because now it's used versus new. So buying a new car in a free market world will often have a higher interest rate attached to it because the value of that car as an asset is going to immediately drop the moment you drive it away from the car lot. So if you default on that loan within the first year and the bank has to come take it back and sell that car, they're not going to get as much money as you owe them. Now, the reason that most car rates on new cars are low is because they're not being financed independently by banks. They're being financed by the company selling you the car so that they can sell you the car. In effect, they're giving you credit. You can pay us later for this car so we can sell it to you today. And we'll charge you a lower interest rate so you can afford to pay a higher price. And so you can afford to get financed. But the risk associated with that transaction is higher, and therefore car rates are typically higher than home rates. And this has to do with the value of the asset. So you have the car as an asset, but you also have the car loan. So when you owe somebody, when it's a debt that you owe somebody, that's what's known as a liability in financial terms. So assets are what you own. Liabilities are what you owe. And the difference between the two is what is your termed net worth. And don't twist term net worth off of a financial term and into your personal value as a person. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking strictly financial terms. We're talking strictly about the value of assets versus the amount of loan you owe on them. But in very simple terms, it's what you have that you could sell for currency, what you owe that you need to repay with currency, and what you'd have left if you were able to sell everything. And obviously, the value that you're going to place on something of an asset is going to be potentially a lot different than what somebody is actually willing to pay for it. So, we're understanding that interest is a factor of many things. So, the value of the asset, underlying asset, and whether or not that's going to reduce in value. The likelihood and history of repayment from the person borrowing. So there's an asset component to it. There's a personal component to it. There's an inflation component to it. So when you take all of those together, inflation, risk, and value of asset, you have an interest rate that is determined. And as I said, those are very different. So if you want to go buy a home loan in 2019, new home loan rates, in fact, why discuss it when you can just Google it? It's so easy to do. So, current home loan rate. Google will kick it down for you. 4.375%, 30-year fixed. It's basically what the current rate is. Okay? So a current home loan rate is 4.37%. 375. The fact that they go out 3 digits, it's also funny. All right, so let's look at what car loan rates are. Okay, 60-month new car loan, 4.93%. That's actually pretty low. Now, the interesting thing to me is that the used car rates are higher. And that doesn't make necessarily a ton of sense to me because of what I talked about as value of the asset. It should almost be the other way. And I'm not sure why they do that. Why a used car rate is higher than a new car rate. But I would assume It's because that car's got a warranty. And that warranty means that you're unlikely to have to come up with large sums of money to repay that, to pay for problems with the car on your own, versus in a used car you would. And so therefore, if you had to come up with a big chunk of money to fix the car, then you might not be able to pay the car loan back. So those are interest rates for assets. Loans relating to assets are called secured loans. So one way to look at interest rates is to say, let's separate them into secure interest rates versus non-secured interest rates. And secured means there's an asset that the bank owns that if you don't pay, they can come and take, and then they can sell that. And anytime a bank wants to give out a loan, this is exactly what they want. They call it collateral. The collateral is what you're buying. All right. So, second category is what's known as unsecured rates. So these are for things like food or other items that they really don't want to attach to and sell. No one wants to come sell your $1,000 TV that you bought, because 6 months later, if you don't pay for it, then they don't want to come take your TV and try and sell a TV, because the amount of effort it will take to sell a TV will cost them more than the value of the TV that they're going to get back. Now, there are companies that do that will sell you a TV with a loan. And it's very, very high rates. And I strongly recommend against doing any of that, ever. There's just no way to do it. The only time you should use debt is for major purchases. So now we're going to look at what student loan interest rates are, because student loans are different. So unsubsidized student loans, 6.6%. Student loans is one of these where we really can't classify it. There's obviously no asset behind it. There's nothing that the bank can come take and sell. Right? Now, you as the individual, if you took out student loans, you want to believe, well, I'm the asset. That's great. They can't sell you. That's illegal, at least in this country. Otherwise, they probably would be selling people in this country who don't repay their student loans, which is terrible, but it's conceivably very possible. So what I'm reading right now is subsidized undergraduate, roughly 5%. Now, I don't know how much of the loans that's for, and I just talked to a friend of mine who said all of his were financed at 8%. So I'm not sure that I believe all of these rates. I'm sure that it depends on how much you're borrowing. And maybe these are just for specific federal loans. But student loan rates are in the middle. And here's why. Because although there's not an asset that they can attach to, you can't discharge them in bankruptcy. So the probability that you're unable to repay, well, in any other circumstance, if there's collateral attached to it, i.e. if there's a car or a house, then you don't pay that payment, they can come take that car or that house, and they can sell that and get their money back. They can't do that with a student loan, but here's the thing. You can't get out of that debt either. All the other debts, all the sorts of credit card debt, you could declare bankruptcy and all of that get wiped away potentially. Student loan debt, you can't do it. So on the one hand, that keeps student rates lower than they would be in a free market. On the other hand, it makes it really, really valuable asset to loan people money for student loans, because they're going to pay a higher interest rate and they can't get rid of it ever. So it doesn't, because of the law surrounding it, it doesn't have to have collateral and can still get a low rate. Okay, so finally, we're going to look up what is the unsecured loan rates, assuming you can get them. Unsecured lending club, unsecured loans up to $40,000, rates as low as 6.16%. Possibly, but I doubt it. the annual percentage rate on a personal loan will range from 10% to 28%. Excellent credit score, 10.3 to 12.5. That's the average. Okay. So on a home loan, we're at 4.375%. On a used car, we're at 6%. And on an unsecured personal line, we're at 10.3 to 12.5%. So again, we talk about the things that go into these interest rates. Okay, so A, inflation. So inflation right now in the U.S. is running, we'll just call it 2%. That's what the Fed would like to see. So included in this, inflation, 2%. Okay? Then you've got asset risk. So asset risk on a home is really low. So we're just going to, on a home, we're going to say that asset risk is 0. I don't really believe that's totally true, but here's the thing about a home loan. Usually you have to put 20% down. So the odds that the house drops below that 20%, and obviously I realize there's 3% first-time home buyers and all that. We will get into all these details later. But on the average, what they want you to do to get that best rate is put down 20%. So the odds that the house is going to drop more than 20%, and if you can't repay the loan, that the bank's going to end up actually losing money on it, is very low. So I'm going to put that at 0 because for the lowest home loan rate, that's what that's going to be assumed. So on the used car, let's say the asset rate on that is another 2%. And on the unsecured rate, that asset rate is going to be much higher. But first, let's go on the personal risk rate. So on the home loan, then the personal risk rate is the difference. So let's just say it's 2.375% personal risk rate on a home. And that's basically going to be the best person ever. The best person to lend to gets the best rates, right? The people with the most amount of collateral and other assets so that they're very low risk. So let's just say this person's a 2% personal risk rate. So on a home loan, they have a 2% personal risk rate, 2% inflation rate. They get the best home rate of 4.375. Personal risk rate of 2%, asset risk rate of 2%, inflation rate of 2%, the used car rate is 6%. Unsecured loan, no assets behind it. Your personal risk rate, let's just say it's still 2%. Now your asset risk rate has got to go up. So that's going to be the 6 to 8%. Because there is no asset. The asset is that you have money in the bank, that you have other assets you could sell to potentially repay this loan. And the inflation rate's still 2%, so those things all add up together. So when you get to having things that have no security behind them, i.e. have no intrinsic value of an asset that the bank could easily attach to and sell. And if you look around your house, you say, well, I have all this furniture, I have all these things, I have all my possessions that are valuable. But if you look at the way that a bank's going to look at it, it's, okay, well, I have to come and take that from you. So I have to send somebody there to take it. Then I have to pay somebody to get it ready to sell. I have to pay somebody to sell it. In the meantime, we have to warehouse it and transport it and all these other things, which means that at the end of the day, the bank's not really going to make very much money on it unless you've got artifacts of art or really high cost dollar items in your house. Pretty much everything in your house, as far as a creditor is concerned, somebody loaning you money, it's all useless. It's only useful to them if they say, you take that guitar down and you sell it at a pawn shop. You take your snowboard and sell it at a pawn shop. Then you bring me that money. That money's good. Other than that, I don't want your stuff. In the same way that we don't want to have the barter system anymore, where you give me 10 chickens for my table, and I need 2 chickens, and I kill them, and I have 8 chickens, and I got to go figure out something else to do with it. Well, just for the hassle of having to deal with the 8 chickens, I might charge you for, you got to give me another 5 chickens just to deal with the hassle. So that's the way that companies issuing you credit work, because they don't want to come foreclose. A bank never wants to come foreclose on your house. A bank never wants to come foreclose on your car. The only reason they're going to do that is because they don't think you're ever going to repay them. And so they feel like they don't have an option at the end of the day. So here's what gets really interesting in this is as your credit score drops, i.e., the personal risk attached to you as defined in a credit score. And when we go into the advanced stuff, we will go into everything that a credit score entails so you understand how you can change that metric for yourself. But if you have a poor credit score, instead of paying 10 to 12% interest, you pay 28 to 32 because your personal risk part of that goes way, way, way up. And without assets that someone can attach to and take and sell, the likelihood you don't repay goes up. And so therefore the risk premium associated with the idea that if I loan you $100, that you're going to actually repay me my $100. Well, if you've borrowed money from 5 other people and you haven't repaid any of them, then you have poor credit. That's literally the idea behind it. The idea of a credit score is to show what you've done in the past, who you borrowed money from, who you paid it back to. Did you do that according to the terms of which you agreed to? i.e., are you being trustworthy? And if you are being trustworthy, you get charged lower rates. If you're not being trustworthy, you pay higher rates. So this is how an interest rate is determined. Most people don't think about why an interest rate exists and what it is and why it's different for them. Now, here's the part about this that if you don't know, if you haven't been through basic financial education, if you don't know these things, if you don't realize that your interest rate is higher specifically because there are things that you have ignored on your credit report, for example, or you have not built your credit in an intelligent manner, then you're going to pay more for borrowing money, which means you're going to have less money. So part of what I'm trying to do with this podcast is to educate everybody on the basics, on where this all comes from, because nobody talks about these things in this way. In my memory of how I've learned most of these, it's cobbling it together from various different books and trying to figure out why and what the interrelationship between all of these things are. So I'm trying to keep it simple for everybody, but I'm trying to give you the examples so you can context this. Because the next episode, we're going to talk the whole time about compounding interest and how that works and how that makes a difference. And not just compounding interest when it's working for you, but the huge problem that most people run into when they can't do this math is compounding interest working against you. And here's the simplification of that. And I want to start this idea, and then we're really going to dive into it and continue it on the next podcast. And we've done quite a bit here. We've talked about inflation. We've talked about assets. We've talked about liabilities. We've talked about what credit is. We've talked about when you use credit, but then you don't pay, then it becomes a debt. And with debts, there's interest, which is the cost of the time you're going to have that money or have that currency or have that available to you. Here's the easiest way I can explain compounding interest to you. It works like this. I'm going to loan you that $100. And because I know you didn't pay back Billy Bob, and you didn't pay back Joe, and you didn't pay back Sarah, and you didn't pay back Nancy. You're a high credit risk. So I'm really even uneasy about loaning you my $100 because I'm really concerned about getting it back because I earned that $100. And I could just as well go spend that $100 and enjoy myself today. But you want to borrow it, so I'm willing to let you borrow it. So I'm going to let you borrow it at the unfriendly interest rate, but adapted for your risk of 25%. So at 25%, I give you the $100 on January 1st. And this is just really simple interest. So January 1st, the following year, how much do you owe me? You owe me $125. That's on really simple annual compounding interest. And we'll get into interest in detail, like I said, in the next one. Understand a lot more of this. But now what if you can't afford to pay me then? Well, then the interest keeps going. But now isn't there not only interest on the $100 that you owe me, there's interest on the $25 that you also haven't paid me. Or let's make it even simpler. You borrowed $100. We get to the end of the year and you go, I don't have the whole thing to pay you back, but I can pay you back $25. I can at least pay you the interest that I owe you. And I say, thanks, I will take your $25 interest. And guess what? You can do that again next year. And so we go another year, and it gets to the end of the year. And you go, I don't have enough. I got $50. And I said, great, I'll take your $50. And you think, hey, I've now repaid you $75, but what have you really repaid me? Not 75, because 25 of its interest for 1 year, the next year another 25 of its interest. So you've only repaid me $25. So we get to the end of the third year. And you go, okay, I've got the interest on the $75, which is roughly 18. Math's not working in my head today. Let's just say it's 15. So you give me that money, and you go, okay, here's $50 in addition. So you go, I'm giving you $70. I'm almost repaid. And in fact, I've already given you more money than the $100 to begin with, but yet I continue to owe. So what compounding interest means is that there's interest on the interest. So a better example for that, and I could delete that, but I won't. I'll just leave it and go. A better example is you get to the end of the first year and you owe me $125 and you don't pay me a penny. And I say, all right, well, at the end of the second year, you better have all my money. So come to the end of the second year. Now you owe me $25 on the first 100 I lent you. The additional $25 you were supposed to pay me back, you owe me 25% on that too. So now you don't owe me, now you owe me almost $150. Actually, you owe me more than that. And you're going, wait a minute, how could I owe you so much more money? And then I have to break it down and show you. And I said, oh, okay, here's how I show it to you, buddy. Here's your $100. You owe me that, right? Yep. After 1 year, add on 25. Did you repay me that? No. So now you owe me $125. So year 2, I get $25 on the original 100. I get another $5 on that 25, which is actually 6. I got to use an easier example with easier rates. So now if you actually want to repay that $100 loan after 2 years, it's $155 you owe me. So at 2 years with a very high interest rate, you're paying 1.5 times what something would have cost originally. And if you let that go 3 years, that's going to be $25 after the first year, $25 after the second year, plus an extra $6, plus $25 for the third year, plus 2 more $6s. That's $199. So in 3 years at a high interest rate, what you owe me has doubled. That's how compounding interest works. So I'm going to provide a lot clearer examples, and we're going to talk about it more from the perspective of you owe. Because the problem that I see in America right now is no one's calculating what they owe and what that real repayment is. Because not only do you have to earn more money to pay me back in interest, but you have to earn money first and pay taxes. And this is what I call the real math. The real math is that the earnings required for you to repay what I'm lending you. And they include not just the amount that I lent you. It includes the interest. And then you have to pay the taxes first. So in the same way that we're going to talk about this with student loans a lot, but we're also going to talk about it with debt a lot because it matters, because it's huge amounts of money. So in the same way, most of the talk of compounding interest for people is, oh, in your retirement, you're compounding interest in year over year and how that makes sense. Well, guess what? There's a devil side to compounding interest where it works against you. So, quick review of what we learned today. Inflation. That's when your money each year loses part of its value, mostly to the growth of economies or potentially because nobody in the world believes that your government's going to repay that or nobody wants to invest in your country. Those are all problems that reduce your buying power of your currency. So we reviewed currency again to exchange value. We've gone over interest, which is the cost of time on money. And we've gone into the factors that go into your interest rate: inflation, asset risk, and your personal risk. We've talked about assets and what they are, things that are worth money. We've talked about liabilities, what you owe. And the difference between those asset liabilities is your net financial worth. So these are all terms that you're going to need to know in life. Terms that are essential to a solid financial foundation. Essential to you keeping your financial freedom and not working for others. If you don't understand the math, then it's hard for you. It's going to be hard for you in a capitalist society. Because capital is an asset. Capital is often currency or something that you could exchange for currency. So we're going to talk about all these things and more. So I hope you stay tuned. I hope you stay with this program. It's really meant to try and explain it to you in a rational manner of these concepts of how you interact with it daily. So this is Keep Yours, trying to keep you clear of debt, trying to keep you a survival path in capitalism. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Keep Yours podcast. If you like what you've heard, head on over to iTunes to subscribe and leave us a review. This will help us reach more listeners, grow the show, and keep putting out more episodes like this one. Check out show notes and more resources at www.keepyours.org. See you next week.